At dinner, my son looked me dead in the eye and said, "Mom's right. You never actually did anything for this family. Doug's the one who actually shows up." I didn't say a single word back to him. 3 weeks later, the man my son was defending didn't have a job, didn't have a title, and didn't have a single person left at that company willing to return his calls. And that same week, my ex-wife called me in a full panic, asking me what I'd done. My name is Ray Mitchell. I'm 45 years old, and I live just outside Charlotte, North Carolina. 14 years ago, I bought a small, struggling fleet logistics company out of bankruptcy for almost nothing, and I built it into one of the largest regional freight and vehicle service operations in the Carolinas, but you wouldn't know that from looking at me. I still wear a plain gray fleece to every dinner. I still drive a used pickup with 190,000 miles on it, and for years I never once mentioned money in front of my son. My son Ethan is 14. He's lived with his mother, Karen, since our divorce 4 years ago. I see him every Wednesday night and every other weekend, and in 4 years I have never once missed a Wednesday. Not for weather, not for work, not for anything. That particular Wednesday started out exactly like the others. By the end of it, everything between me and my ex-wife's husband had changed for good. Karen and I were married for 12 years before it fell apart. There wasn't a big blow-up. It was slower than that. Two people who stopped wanting the same life. I worked long hours building the company, and I never talked about it much when I got home, because I didn't think it mattered to Ethan whether his dad was successful or not. I just thought it mattered that I showed up. Karen wanted more conversation, more presence, more of the version of a husband who talked about his day at the dinner table. I don't blame her for wanting that. I just never became a different man to keep her happy. When we split, I didn't fight over money. My lawyer told me I could have pushed harder on the business valuation, on the house, on a dozen things. I told him I didn't want a war. I wanted Ethan to have a quiet, normal childhood, not a courtroom battle he'd remember forever. So I signed what needed signing, paid child support early every month, and never once said a bad word about Karen in front of my son. Karen met Doug about a year after the divorce was final. Doug worked in regional operations management, mid-level, steady paycheck, company truck. The kind of job that comes with a title that sounds bigger than it actually is. Ethan liked him right away. Doug took him to baseball games, bought him things I didn't always buy him, and talked a big game about someday. Someday a promotion, someday a bigger house, someday a boat. Karen and Doug married about a year later, and Ethan moved into a nicer house on the other side of town. I never said anything negative about Doug. Not once, even as Ethan started comparing the two households more and more. I told myself that was normal for a kid his age. I told myself it didn't matter what he thought of me, as long as I kept showing up every single Wednesday like clockwork. Looking back now, I think that quiet approach is exactly what let a man like Doug spend 3 years quietly rewriting the story of who the reliable man in Ethan's life really was. That Wednesday, Karen asked if we could all have dinner together. Her, Doug, Ethan, and me. Since Ethan's school schedule had gotten complicated, and she wanted to go over logistics as a group. I said yes, because I never wanted Ethan to feel like there was tension between the adults in his life. We met at a barbecue place near Ethan's school. Nothing fancy, booths and paper napkins. Doug spent the first 10 minutes talking about a promotion he was basically about to get. Regional supervisor, bigger territory, company car upgrade. Ethan sat there nodding, eyes wide, the way kids do when an adult makes their life sound exciting. At some point, the conversation drifted to scheduling. Who picks up Ethan on which days? Who paid for what activity? I mentioned calmly that I could shift a few work meetings around to make pickups easier. Nothing dramatic, just logistics. Karen sighed and said, "It would help if you were around more in general, Ray." Doug's the one who actually handles things day to day. Before I could respond, Ethan jumped in, loud enough that two nearby tables looked over. Yeah, Dad, Mom's right. You never actually did anything for this family. Doug's the one who actually shows up. The table went quiet. Karen's face flickered, not quite guilt, not quite agreement, somewhere in between. Doug looked down at his plate and picked at his fries like he suddenly found them very interesting. I sat there for a second, looking at my son, and I felt something shift in my chest. I didn't let it show. A waiter walked by and refilled our drinks, and for a moment the sound of ice hitting glass was the only thing at the table. I could have said a lot in that moment. I could have told Ethan exactly what I built, how many families depend on paychecks I sign off on, how the promotion Doug was bragging about ran through an org chart that eventually landed on my desk, whether either of them realized it or not. I could have taken Doug apart right there with facts he didn't know I had. I didn't say any of it. I just looked at my son and said, "Okay, bud, you want to finish your fries before we head out?" Karen tried weakly to tell Ethan that wasn't a nice thing to say, but it came out soft, unconvincing, like part of her agreed with him. Doug never said a word in my defense. He just sat there looking mildly pleased with himself, like he'd won something he didn't even understand the stakes of. The rest of dinner went by quiet. I paid the bill like I always did, hugged Ethan goodbye, told him I loved him, and said I'd see him Saturday. I drove home in silence, no radio, just my son's voice on a loop in my head. You never actually did anything for this family. I wasn't angry at Ethan. He's 14. Kids repeat the story that's told around them at home, but I was done letting that story sit there uncorrected. Not to hurt my son, but because I'd let people believe something about me that wasn't true, and I'd let it go on far too long. Here's what Ethan didn't know, what Karen didn't know, and what Doug had absolutely no idea about. 14 years ago, I bought a failing regional logistics company called Palmetto Fleet Solutions out of bankruptcy court for almost nothing. I restructured it slowly, quietly, through a holding company with my name nowhere near the letterhead, because I never wanted my son growing up thinking a company was the measure of his father. Over the years, Palmetto Fleet grew into one of the larger regional service and fleet management operations in the Carolinas, the same company that 3 years earlier had hired a mid-level operations coordinator named Doug Reyes. I hadn't planned that. It wasn't some elaborate setup. Doug got that job on his own, through a normal hiring process, at a company he had no idea I owned. I kept it that way on purpose. I never touched day-to-day staffing decisions. I trusted my COO, a man named Bill Hargrove, to run operations without me hovering over every name on the payroll. I didn't even know Doug worked there until Karen mentioned the company name once, in passing, about a year into their marriage. I filed that away and never brought it up, not to Karen, not to Doug, not even to Bill. I got home a little after 9 that night and sat in my kitchen without turning on the lights. I kept hearing Ethan's voice. I wasn't planning anything reckless. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't trying to destroy anyone out of spite. But I realized I'd spent 3 years quietly staying out of the way of a man who used the stability of a company I built to sit across from my son and let him call me a man who never did anything. That didn't sit right with me anymore. The next morning, I called Bill Hargrove, my coup, the man who'd run day-to-day operations at Palmetto Fleet for 9 years. I didn't say a word about Doug. I simply asked him to send over the current regional org chart and a performance summary for the operations division, something I hadn't personally reviewed in over a year. I told him I wanted to get closer to the numbers again. That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. By that afternoon, I had a full picture. Doug's division had missed its quarterly targets twice in the past year. His promotion wasn't finalized. It was still sitting on a shortlist with 2 other candidates, pending final sign-off from regional leadership. In other words, pending sign, not from people who ultimately answered to me. I sat with that information for a full day before doing anything, because I wanted to be sure I wasn't acting out of anger. By the next morning, I wasn't angry anymore. I was just finished. Monday, I called Bill again and asked a simple, ordinary question. The kind of question any owner is entitled to ask about any promotion. I asked him to walk me through why that particular candidate was being considered for a supervisor role, given 2 missed targets in the last 4 quarters. I didn't tell him to reject anyone. I didn't mention Ethan or the dinner or anything personal at all. I just asked him to make sure the decision reflected performance, not tenure or personality. Bill said that was fair and told me he'd take a closer look before finalizing anything. Tuesday, Bill called me back. He said, after reviewing the numbers more closely, leadership had decided to go with a different candidate for the supervisor position, someone with a stronger track record. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that Doug hadn't taken the news well and had gotten into a heated exchange with his regional manager over it. I didn't ask Bill to do anything more than that. I didn't need to. Wednesday, Ethan texted me, which almost never happened outside our usual days. He said Doug had been in a bad mood all week, snapping at everyone, and that his mom kept telling him not to worry about it. I told Ethan grown-up stuff sometimes gets complicated, and asked him how his math test went instead. I wasn't going to put any of this on my son. Thursday, Bill called again, this time with something I hadn't asked for. He said Doug's behavior toward his regional manager after the promotion decision had escalated into a formal complaint, raised voice, some language HR had to document, the kind of thing that gets written up regardless of who the employee is. Bill said it wasn't his place to ask, but he mentioned Doug's name was now under review for a possible write-up, maybe worse, depending on how HR handled it. I told Bill that sounded like something HR should handle exactly the way they'd handle it for anyone else. No favors, no interference either way. I meant that. Friday, everything moved faster than I expected. Ethan called me that evening, sounding confused, saying Doug had been on the phone with someone from work all afternoon, arguing, and that his mom kept telling him it was nothing. I kept my voice calm and normal and asked him about baseball practice instead. I wasn't going to let any of this touch him more than it already had. That same night, Karen texted me. She said Doug had come home saying HR was investigating an incident at work, and he might be suspended pending review. She asked almost casually if I'd heard anything, since I used to work in logistics too, years ago, before whatever it is you do now. I told her I hadn't heard anything specific. That was true, I hadn't asked for updates. I hadn't needed to. Saturday morning, Ethan called me crying, which almost never happens. He said Doug had gotten a call early that morning and started yelling in the driveway, something about being terminated, something about this isn't fair, while the neighbors watched. I told Ethan that sometimes when people don't meet expectations at work, things catch up all at once, and that it had nothing to do with him. He asked if I knew why it was happening. I told him I honestly didn't know the details. That part wasn't entirely true. But it was close enough to true that I could say it and mean most of it. Sunday afternoon, the day I was supposed to pick Ethan up, Karen called sounding completely unlike herself, none of her usual confidence, just fast, panicked words. She said Doug had been let go from Palmetto Fleet after an HR review, that his severance was minimal, and that with his job gone, they were already behind on the new truck payment and the mortgage on the bigger house. Then her voice caught, and she asked the question I knew was coming eventually. She said she'd looked up the ownership of Palmetto Fleet Solutions online, out of pure panic, trying to understand what had happened, and found a holding company listed as majority owner. A holding company with my name buried 3 layers down in a public filing. She asked me straight out if I owned the company Doug worked for. I didn't deny it. I told her the truth calmly. The same way I'd handled everything that week? I told her yes, I'd owned Palmetto Fleet for 14 years, long before Doug ever applied there, and that I'd stayed completely out of hiring and daily operations the entire time Doug worked there. Until this past week, when I simply asked my COO to make sure a promotion decision was based on performance, nothing more. She went quiet. Then she asked if any of it, the missed promotion, the write-up, the termination, had anything to do with me. I could hear Ethan in the background asking what was wrong. I answered her honestly. I told her I hadn't done anything outside normal business practice. I hadn't fired Doug. I hadn't written him up. I'd asked one fair question about one promotion, and everything after that had been the natural result of Doug's own performance and his own reaction to not getting what he expected. I told her I started asking that question the same week our son sat across from me and told me I never did anything for this family, while she and Doug said nothing to correct him. Karen went silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was shaking. She said she didn't know Doug's job was even connected to me. She said if she'd known, she never would have let Ethan say what he said without saying something herself. I told her I believed her, and I did, because Karen has never been a cruel person, just someone who sometimes doesn't look closely enough at what's standing in front of her. I still picked Ethan up that Sunday, because whatever was happening between the adults, I wasn't going to break the one thing that had never wavered in 4 years. We went to the same barbecue place, quieter this time, just the two of us in a booth by the window. About halfway through his plate, Ethan finally asked if the trouble at his mom's house had anything to do with me. I decided he deserved the truth in a way a 14-year-old could actually understand. I told him I owned the company Doug worked for and that I've owned it since before his mom and Doug ever met. I told him I never used that to hurt anyone, until the week he told me I never did anything for our family, in front of a man who never once corrected him. Ethan went pale. He set his fork down. He said he didn't know any of that he only said what he said because Doug always talked about promotions and bonuses, and being the one who showed up. And it made my quiet, ordinary life sound small by comparison. I told him I understood and that I wasn't angry with him. I told him that talking loudly about success doesn't make someone reliable, and that showing up every single Wednesday for 4 straight years, paying every bill on time, and never once saying a bad word about his mother, that was the real measure of a man, even if nobody ever mentioned it at a dinner table. Ethan got quiet, and then he said he was sorry. Real quiet, real serious. The kind of sorry that actually means something. A month later, Karen and Doug's marriage didn't survive the fallout. Doug moved out at the end of that month, still without steady work. Karen and Ethan stayed in the house. I made sure of that much quietly, through the mortgage lender, without either of them ever knowing I'd made a call. I never gloated to Karen. I never spoke to Doug again after that Wednesday dinner. I didn't need to. Ethan comes to my place 3 nights a week now instead of just Wednesdays, an arrangement Karen asked for herself once things settled. He's never once told me I don't do anything for this family again. Honestly, I never needed him to take it back for my own sake. I did it so he'd understand something that actually matters. The quiet, steady people in your life are usually the ones holding everything up, even when nobody claps for it. Some nights Ethan and I just sit on my porch after dinner, not talking about much, and that's enough for me. I built my whole life around showing up, not showing off. It took one loud comment at a dinner table to finally show my own son the difference. If you made it this far, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button, because there are plenty more stories like this one coming, real families, real situations, and real quiet victories nobody sees coming until they're already done.